I'm Gina Vild. I'm Associate Dean for Communications and External Relations. Welcome to today's Talk at 12. With the Super Bowl only days away, the topic of tackling football injuries could not be more timely. So thank you for being with us today, and also a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us through live streaming, and those who are joining through our first ever Periscope broadcast through Twitter. Thank you for being with us. It's been said that baseball is America's pastime, but football is America's passion. This has never been more clear as the game attracts fans representing every demographic across the country. In the United States, the 6 most watched television shows of all times are the Super Bowl. And yes, it was a disappointment that our New England Patriots won't be playing this Sunday, but still, Super Bowl 50 is expected to exceed 114 million viewers. It's because of audiences like this that the football championship is easily the most watched show in America's history. But increasingly, the topic of football-related injuries is flooding the news. Only last Friday, the New York Times published an article citing that concussion diagnosis increased by nearly 1/3 over the last year due to new health and safety measures that aid detection that the NFL has put in place. And for those who follow this game, it's been a season of some notable injuries. Some of Harvard's leading researchers, working in collaboration with physician scientists from our Harvard Medical School teaching hospitals, are trying to better understand and address the complex issues players face through the Football Players Health Study at Harvard University. Here's a brief video that highlights this effort.
Each individual former player has a chance to be involved with the Players Health Study here at Harvard University that directly relates to them.
It's not concussions only or joints only. It really is looking at the whole player, and we're concerned about the whole life.
What's different about this study is that it's a partnership with the players. It's not Harvard studying them. It's a we.
That's the incentive right there, because this is coming from the players to study themselves, to study us. That's groundbreaking.
We're by the players and for the players. And no study is like that. No study really talks to their subject population and says, what is important to you?
There's that respect level across the board, from the researchers to the doctors to the players and vice versa.
And then you get to see some of the leading guys who are doing their thing behind the group. They're like, oh man, who's this guy right here? He's the Tom Brady of what? That guy is the Barry Sanders of who? When I see that excellence, I am so familiar with it that I naturally try to do, and this is about being a part of a team, how can I fit to make it better?
We're committed to help the former players today while we engage them to learn for the benefit of the next generations of former players and of the population at large.
This is a landmark study. This can literally change the way people think about their health.
Implications for college, it's implications for high school players, implications, as we said, for kids who are making decisions about and their families. Should they play or should they not be given the opportunity to play?
This is going to reach so much further than pro football.
I'm pleased to introduce 2 of the study's co-directors who, together with Lee Nadler of HMS and Dana-Farber and Bill Meehan of Boston Children's Hospital, are leading the study. Alvaro Pascual-Leone is a professor of neurology. Alvaro Pascual-Leone is a professor of neurology and an associate dean for clinical and translational research at Harvard Medical School. He serves as the chief for the Division of Cognitive Neurology and the director of the Burnson Allen Center for Non-Invasive Brain Stimulation at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. He is a world leader in research and development, clinical application, and teaching of non-invasive brain stimulation. Ross Zafonte is the Earl P. and Ida S. Charlton Chairman of the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehab at Harvard Medical School. He is the Vice President of Medical Affairs at Spaulding Rehab Hospital and Chief of Physical Medicine and Rehab at Massachusetts General Hospital. He is a world-renowned expert on traumatic brain injury. Please join me in welcoming our guest speakers.
So I get to go first. And the first thing I would say is thank you. Thank you to our collaborators. Gina listed a few of them, and thank you all for being here. We are only able to do this because we've set up an extraordinary team. And that's people throughout Harvard and people external and the former players who we're getting tremendous input back from. And our PI, Dr. Lee Nadler. So why is everybody so interested in this? Why is this so important? Gina touched on just a couple of the issues of why. It's the most watched thing in America, and frankly, all over the place, North America. The worldwide viewing keeps going up. The ratings this year, despite all the notoriety of injury, are higher than they were last year. And we have a compelling reason to want to know. We have 53 active players every week, almost 1,700 players throughout the league who are ongoing. And we have millions involved in youth-related sport and in collegiate sport that are not only football, but are other contact sport from which this study will help inform. It's not a parallel population, but will help inform. Football was under threat in the 1900s when Teddy Roosevelt intervened because of the number of injuries. What we want to do, what we seek to do, is really go back and understand what is going on, what in these unique group of people is forming the changes that they experience throughout their life. And I'll talk more about that. Why this is important, I'm going to touch for a second on my own experience. I've had the privilege of treating former players in the past. And one of the things you notice about them is they are more than just bigger than a lot of other people and stronger. They're uniquely driven individuals. You don't get there without being driven. You don't get there without being focused. You don't get there without being the 1% of the 1%. And within that, uniquely being able to take in visual stimuli quickly and react to it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be employed very long. Now, one of the critical issues is what we are not. What we are not, as was said in the video, is we're not just a concussion study. No way. Because even if we were to elucidate that issue alone, it's one of the many things we're tackling, we're going to leave a lot of former players still with significant issues. So it's part of this study. It's not the whole study. And that's part of what makes us different. This is a unique, comprehensive look at player health from beginning to end, and Alvaro will detail a piece of that. So what has been our treatise? Our treatise has been, hey, the primary focus is on player health, and we need a collaboration on player health. So you heard in the video a bit about that. And where we came to look at this is something in my area of work, almost participatory kind of research. We're interested in the affected population. What do they really see as the most important issues in their life impacting function, impacting their quality of life, impacting what happens to them on a daily basis? And then how do we develop ways to diagnose, mitigate, and maybe transform some of those injuries. And we need to understand who these people uniquely are, and I'll touch on that in a minute. We also focused with our collaborators at Harvard Law School on the issue of confidential and secure information. This is a very tenuous time for former players, a time associated with legal action, a time associated with rampant media, a time associated with concern and threat related to information they receive almost on a daily basis. How do we assure that the information they get is correct? One of our big things was, if you're going to participate, we're going to do whatever we humanly can to respect your confidentiality, because these unique people are identifiable. And so we fought very hard with our colleagues at Harvard Law School to make sure we got an NIH certificate of confidentiality, to protect our data as much as is possible, to do what we can do to assure that we build that relationship of trust. I'll tell a story in just a second about a former player who I know very well, who's in the last several weeks received 11 letters on 11 different studies. Everybody is in this game. What we're interested in is, how do we transform the lives of former players and use that information to impact the future? We need to understand more about diversity. Diversity is more than just racial diversity, although that's incredibly important, because likely over 65% of present-day NFL players are African American. But there's more to it than that. There's diversity about where you grew up. Over 60% are from the South. What are your belief systems? How were you raised? What were the epigenetic issues that influenced your life? And we're managing this, thanks to Lee's input, with innovative teams in focused interest areas, so we can deliver things now and then refine them in the future. So it's not a study based on, you're isolated, we give you this little bit of money, you're isolated, we give you this little bit of money. It is consistently managed and focused on outcome and deliverables. And as I said before, knowledge translation is really important. A common complaint of really a lot of research participants, especially former players, is, hey, I didn't get any feedback. I didn't get any feedback. So we're dedicated to giving feedback as we can, as is appropriate, to former players regarding, hey, we noticed this instance of sleep apnea among offensive linemen. We need to, if you meet these criteria, this may be a thing to address. So to go back to that idea about participatory and research, we wanted players' engagements, and so we went out on quite a little effort to get to former players and say, hey, what are the most important issues to you? Now, one of the most important issues that came up is really one that was also in a USA Today survey several years ago, knee injury and knee osteoarthritis and degenerative issues of the knee and associated functional impairments from that. Chronic pain is a constant complaint of former players, but they may manifest it differently. And let me tell you what I mean by that. When we talk with former players, one of the things we notice is these are gentlemen who are selected out to be able to tolerate pain, to play their career from pain, and if you couldn't, you don't last very long again. So they're not used to accommodating related to the pain. If we ask them, can you get something done? Can you get through your home? Can you go do an errand? Yes, I can. I do it. It hurts, but I do it. What is the impact of that pain? And what's the impact of all the medicines they took to mitigate that pain during their career and afterwards? No issue over the past decade, perhaps, has ramped up in the American consciousness from a health perspective, like concussion. Concussion is really hit the headlines almost every day sometimes. And it really was driven by a sentinel series of reports that came out in 2005 and 2006 linking long-term concussion to long-term neurodegenerative risk. But there are so many issues that we do not understand with that. We don't understand who's going to get into long-term problems. We don't understand what the genetic risks are. What are the manifestations of that? How are other things interrelated, as we'll talk about? And so we're making this clarion call that things shouldn't be looked at in isolation, but in an integrative manner. If you look at cardiovascular health, one of the things that Alvaro will touch briefly on is the role that some of our colleagues have had in trying to determine the fact that whether the way players train, specifically strength-trained athletes, in and of itself results in a thickening of their heart walls, a risk for hypertension, and a form of cardiomyopathy. Remember, I think we have a distinguished former player in the audience, but few plays go on more than 5-6 seconds. And so it's really full out force multiple times. What does that mean long-term for cardiovascular risk? Now, to get this done, it's really important that we think about more than just ourselves. When Dr. Nadler brought everyone together, and certainly Alvaro, Bill, and I helped, we thought of this as a broad, one Harvard kind of effort. So we see this as an important broad collaboration to solve the myriad of issues. And we feel those myriad of issues will have a benefit not only to former players and present-day players, but to others and other unique populations. So we've brought together the Harvard hospitals. All of them are affiliated here. A broad element of Harvard itself, the law school, our academic collaborators throughout Harvard, and even external for some of our projects out of the country. We're interested in who the best experts are and how do we solve the problem, and even collaborating with some of our federal agencies. Remember, some of the lessons we've learned in this population can be garnered from the military or from others. Now, to take a page from Dr. Nadler, one of the things that we have to think about is really catalyzing health. How do we ask the right translational questions? How do we put right investigators together forming right communities? How do we do right tools and technologies? One of the things about most all of the studies in the past regarding former players is they've been important contributions. Nobody would say otherwise, but they've been limited by rather small populations, limited data, death certificate studies. Those are important, but we're interested in what's going on in the people who are alive. And they've led to associations that we don't know are true. So if we put two things together, first, the comorbidity might be unidirectional in that one condition causes another. That's possible. Second, there might be a bidirectional causal relationship between the two conditions. That's possible. Third, the two conditions might be comorbid due to some shared underlying risk factor, the environment, genetics, exposure, or both. Finally, genetic risk factors or environmental risk factors or exposure might produce a state of neurobiology that underlies many of these conditions, or biomechanical biology. So what's important is we need a paradigm shift. That working in isolation regarding this problem is not going to do it. And we need to understand this as an integrated disease, to bring the bench to the bedside and the bedside to the bench. So we've been collaborating and crossing between fundamental scientists and patients and individuals at risk. And we've looked to develop products, biomarkers, therapeutics, and prevention via selecting the important problem, putting these two together in a managed grouping. Alvaro will talk a little bit about some of our projects that already have produced some success. For example, can we target a therapy for so-called chronic traumatic encephalopathy? Can we look for a biomarker and identify a mechanism? Can we prevent long-term degenerative arthritis after an ACL repair? And we know that this year, the number of ACL injuries actually went up in the NFL. So one way to think of this is as the integrated player. That biological processes are likely related. An example can be inflammation. Inflammation at times can be a good thing in the healing process, but clearly it can also have some negative dilatory consequences in the neurocognitive systems, in the joint systems, and others. Couldn't these be multifactorial? What are the psychosocial risk factors? ADHD, learning disability, or others, and how does that play into things? What about lifestyle? What happens to people after football? You know, as I mentioned, this is the 1% of the 1%. Most really have been recognized since they were 12, 13, 14 as unique individuals. You go from that level of acknowledgement to next day, hey, nobody knows me. That's a real impact on your psychosocial well-being and how you view yourself in this very, very complicated world and environment. And all of these systems may be interlinked to impact clinical function of other systems. Now, this is a slide I love to show because we think about it in some ways as an integrated player. There are pre-injury factors, there are injury exposure and post-injury factors. They lead to cognitive disturbance, emotional disturbance, and physical disturbances. And what we believe is true is not necessarily true. For example, if you have someone who's an offensive lineman and they've been playing at 310, and now they're 420, and they have sleep apnea, and they have hypertension, and they have heart disease, and they're depressed, what is the source of their cognitive deficit? What is the source of their disturbance? So many of these things need to be parsed out importantly because they produce the symptoms that I have for you on the end of the slide that include chronic pain, joint pain, headaches, behavior, how someone approached their training in a biomechanical manner, what their initial treatments were like, or lack thereof, produces this integrated picture. And we need to parse some of that out and understand the biology associated with it. So we've really thought about this as the whole player, the whole life. And we don't think that these are distinctly separate groups of things, but really linked and integrated. Our population studies, as Alvaro will talk about, will tell us more about health status and quality of life. And this will inform our pilot studies, which are already ongoing and successful, that are dedicated to developing new preventative strategies, diagnostics, and treatment. In other words, these things aren't separate, they're all integrated. And our law and ethics team has done an extraordinary job looking at the structural issues related to player health and how that might impact their long-term well-being. So one of the critical issues that I talked about earlier is that participation in these kinds of studies is really problematic and important. Former players are always asked to give back to something. And as I said, there's a myriad of studies going on. But this is different. This is focused. This isn't in isolation. And so we've spent a lot of time, Alex has really led that, going out, explaining the differences, dealing with direct mail, going to events, using former players as ambassadors to explain the situation. So this is very much, in some ways, like the isolated military populations or others, in which really there needs to be an outreach call for this group. And then I think we view this all as that we're different. We're player-driven, i.e., as I said, on the primary goals. We have a focus on the whole player over the player's entire life. And we're focused on addressing biological, individual, and structural factors of health, and then making a meaningful difference within them. It's no good if these differences simply are noted without transferring that knowledge back and doing something for former players. So I will introduce my colleague, Dr. Pascual-Leone.
Thank you.
I have it on, yeah. So thank you, Ross. Maybe I'll start re-emphasizing the point that Ross was sharing. You know, as a clinician, as a physician, we generally remember, at least good clinicians do, that it is about the person we have in front of us. It's not about the walking cancer or the brain stroke or the whatever, stomach ulcer, but it's about Mrs. Jones and Mr. Robinson, and good clinicians know that. That doesn't mean we need to not know about the biology of the disease, but we understand that that disease doesn't exist in isolation. In research, we sometimes, I fear, forget that. We forget that what we're really interested in when doing human research for human health still needs to be anchored in the individual. We need to extract the knowledge about the biology, about the fundamental aspects of the risk factors for health, but we need to relate it back to the individual that is suffering that illness, because the illness may manifest one way or another. And that individual, again, doesn't exist in isolation, but rather exists in a very specific surrounding that may have structural conditions that determine health. Arguably, that is never more clear than in professional football. And we think we have a real opportunity, a real challenge, but a real opportunity in addressing the health and well-being of former football players to learn not only something that makes a difference for their lives and their families and their kids, but for athletes at large and for all of us and other cohorts of individuals, because the challenges, structural, biological, individual, might be different, but they always exist, even if we don't identify them. Because of that, because of the desire to get to that level, we need everyone. We need everyone because when we focus on responders in any one epidemiologic effort, we risk having a biased sample. We risk having a selected sample. And again, never more clear than in football. The truths that we're all hearing about in the press and otherwise are based on studies that at the largest encompass short of 2,500 living players, former players, or 3,000 deceased players. Now, deceased players, as Ross was saying, can inform a lot, but we care about those that are living. And those that are living, 2,500, is a very small sample of the actual N of football players. And of course, those that actually get engaged are either those that have a problem, schematically here with the heart or the brains or the knees, or those that don't have a problem at all and are just sort of researchers, professionals themselves. We want to start with to get a sense of what the prevalence of the problems are in the population, and simple as that may sound, that's something that we don't know for the many problems that are being talked about for football players. So we need everyone. We need everyone to extract information about the population. What is the number? the number of former players, if you go from 1960 to today, why 1960? Because it was the introduction of the hard shell helmet, to today would be somewhere around 15,000. Now, this means accepting as a former player anybody that has been paid a paycheck as a player for an NFL team. It doesn't mean that they played ever on the big stage of televised football games. That's a very small group of former players comparatively. But the others still have the lifestyle in many ways with differences, with different stressors they're important to capture. So we want those 15,000, but we want to remember that those 15,000 are 15,000 specific individuals. We don't want to blur their individual differences. We want to highlight and identify those differences because, as Ross was saying, these are some of our advisors. Each one of them has a very different life, a very different upbringing, a very different biology, a very different position they played, a very different number of years they played, a very different transition to the rest of their life. So we think of this cohort of unique individuals that then have a rather unique life with a degree of physical effort that, I can't even begin to imagine, leave alone do. And they do it continuously for many years with the stressors of will you be selected, will you make it, will you not, with the drive for achievement and the challenges that come with that, with the social recognition and oftentimes the sometimes not quite true social support, and in some instances real social support that can be quite labile and be gone from one moment to the next. When they are cut, there are big transitions. When they make it to the game, to the league, there are big transitions. The impact of transitions themselves becomes a key determinant of unique lives. But we want to remember that that unique population, which, like Ross was saying, may lay way out here in terms of the uniqueness of the individuals from the very beginning, has in itself a distribution of population that different individuals in that population are different. And so our goal has been to understand the meaning of health and affliction for the NFL players. And for that, we have benefited enormously from their guidance. So I want to share the perspective of one of our other advisors that made it particularly clear, at least to me. This is a slide from Damian Richardson. Damian Richardson is one of our advisors. He's also an orthopedic surgery resident who, had been having a hard time communicating because he was on call last week. And I said, "Oh, I know a little bit more about that than I know about football." So the point was that he was picked in 2002, drafted by the Carolina Panthers. He describes himself as a, quote, typical professional player. He was in the league for 6 years. Some have a much longer career, some have a shorter career. He was a reserve safety, a special teams player. He was on minimal salary at the NFL. Didn't mean he didn't work hard, didn't mean he didn't get injured. In fact, he got injured, needed knee reconstruction twice, fractured several vertebrae, was 2 years on injured reserve. Then he was told, "Thank you very much." Actually, probably wasn't told, "Thank you very much." Was told, "Please clear your locker." And that was that. And then he's trying to build a career outside of football. But his point was, you can't focus on this, all of this, because this doesn't exist in vacuum. I'm this kid. I'm this kid who in 1980 was so excited about my gift of a football because I wanted to be a football star, because I knew I can be a football star. And that kid convinced his parents to let him play Pop Warner. And some of you may not know, but last year there were 150,000 football injuries in kids playing Pop Warner, treated in the emergency room, ages 6 to 17. 25 of those injuries in kids 10 years or younger. 100 plus hospitalizations because of those injuries. he had his share. He recovered from it with enough drive to make it to high school. And he is this kid in high school, superstar of the high school team. I don't know if you know, but 10% of high school players suffer injuries that render them unable to complete the year. In high school, I'm not talking the season, I'm talking the year in high school. He had one of those injuries, not season ending. He was blessed with health and made it to college. And then in college, we know that about 7% to 10% have concussions, about 5% have significant fractures. Ankles and knees are the main target of fractures. And he accumulated all this. By the time he got drafted, he was carrying this baggage. What does this baggage do to your health? That needs to be part of what we ask, because unless we ask that, we will never understand what the health of the former football players is and how to best help it. So we need the whole life. And we need the whole player. We need the whole player because, yes, there is genetics, but there is very different development and upbringing. Some of you will have heard or read the comparison of Manning and our own Brady, and very different upbringing, very different backgrounds, very different stories. What impact does that have on overall health? Well, we know that in extreme cases, studied by Harvard faculty and many others, there is an impact of development on brain organization, on brain connectivity. So we know that environmental influences are going to have an effect. We know that these stories of accumulating injuries will have an effect. We know that a brain is not detached from the stomach and the heart and the joints. There are going to be multi-organ interactions. If we want to really address health and well-being rather than understand the pathology of CTE, we're going to have to go beyond any one organ system. But in addition to that, part of health and well-being needs to address the systems, structural factors that condition the individual players' health. These are players that have a health provision system in the setting of clubs, that have specific doctors, that have specific structures, that look out for their well-being in that setting. Is that the best or is that not? Are there risks with that or are there not? These are issues that are important for health and well-being, just like the biological factors are important. And that's the commitment of our study, to address all those. So how do we do that? Well, we start with the players, and of course we start with the literature. Now, I told you already the literature is sort of limited. What we have is what we have. There are descriptions of it, but there are huge knowledge gaps that we want to capture and address. But with the help of the players and informed by the literature, we can set up an initial effort to try to characterize what is the health and wellness of former players today. And that is the process that we embarked in about a year ago. With that, we're going to gather data, and we look at the data not as the end-all, be-all. We want an epidemiologic effort that is on steroids, that is guided by the likes of Frank Spicer and Jim Ware, but that we want to get to a point where rather than just simply characterize the population, we use it as ways to identify additional issues that are important to address, that we identify deficits in knowledge that we need to think about how to fill, and that we generate hypotheses that we can test. And we try to go about testing those hypotheses or filling those knowledge gaps in what I think are rather innovative and different ways. Rather than looking for proposals alone, that is part of what we do, open RFAs, where we try to identify the best ideas that may have meaning, and essentially provide grant support for that work. And I'll tell you a little bit about those type of studies. But beyond that, we want to do case control studies. We want to not say, Rodney Peete should be compared with myself, because I wish I was that accomplished, that athletic, and that big. It'd be great. How do you find the appropriate control group? Well, the best control group is to find all those players that played a given position, that had a given exposure, that had a given role, and compare them against those that match the same experience but didn't have the problems. And do case control studies that way. In order to do that, we need a large population because we want to have those that have heart problems and knee problems, but have different cognitive manifestations, for example, and compare it that way. So case control studies is one set of studies. Another approach is rather than say, tell me your best idea for an imaging of tau or for an imaging of brain damage, is bring together all experts that think they have something that can provide insights and say, if you guys are willing to work together, and only if you're willing to work together, we'll support you. If you think you know so much that you can go at it alone, all the power to you. Good luck. It's a very different way of doing sort of collaboration science here. It's truly team science. It's a team science of rivals coming together. And as Americans, we know the enormous power of rivals coming together. We're hoping to catalyze on that. And for imaging, for neuroimaging, Mike Fox and George Zafonte are developing a protocol with many experts to test comprehensively and come up with the best way to characterize in vivo the potential consequences to the brain. This is just one example. Similarly for heart and for joint biomechanics, but also for translatable models, for animal models. Some questions we should be testing in animal models to be able to translate it to humans. What is the best animal model? Well, we can fund a few, or we can bring those few to work together to develop the best set of models, and that's the approach we've been taking. These are the type of pilots that, in addition, we're funding. Studies led by different teams, specifically aimed at developing new diagnostics, new preventive instruments or strategies, or new therapeutics for specific problems. And they range from a very novel way to repair the ACL that Martha Murray is developing and was able to do the first studies in humans thanks to the support of Football Players Health Study. Instead of doing surgery to replace the ACL, actually providing a scaffolding within the joint to allow it to heal the subject's own ACL. Two animal models looking at what protein changes take place after repeated traumatic brain injury and how that conformational change in the tau protein can be prevented by an antibody that could potentially then be translated in not only a diagnostic but a therapeutic after the trauma to prevent the damage. We can tell you more about this, but just so we get to questions, let me finish coming back to Damian. So when Damian presented recently to the Society for Neuroscience and Neuroethics, made the point, what do former NFL players want? So it's simple. Just want the truth. We want the truth. That's the same thing we want as scientists. We want the truth. We don't want the reported story. We want to know what really are the facts. The decisions as to what to do with the facts are not ours. They are ultimately the individual players in the context of their lives. We need to deliver that truth. In fact, we need to deliver that truth and explain it in such a way that the players and their families can understand it and make the appropriate decisions. But we want to do more. We want to do that in order to translate those truths into new diagnostics, new preventative interventions, new therapeutic interventions, to promote the health of football players. And ultimately, we believe that if we do that, we will learn from this particular series of studies, initiative, lessons that apply to all athletes and frankly, all populations. So that's the ambitious goal of this multi-year effort. And I think we are well on the way with a spectacular team of people. So thank you, and we'll hopefully take your questions and have.
Questions? Questions?
So my impression is that the folks that are playing football are bigger, faster, and stronger as we go through each decade. Is that true or is not true? And if it is true, is there a limit to which one's structure, such as bones, tendons, cartilage, can really withstand the kind of force that is applied to them? And that same goes for concussion, but speaking more about musculoskeletal injury.
So it's probably pretty clear, although we haven't done a separate analysis of it yet, that if you look at people who were playing on the line, offensive line in the 1970s or early 60s, the present-day players are bigger. There's no doubt about it, and that the speed that they can produce from various forms of training is really quite remarkable. The questions would be, has that led directly to altered biomechanics, precedence for further injury, altered collision dynamics? And that's one of the questions in the future we will be asking. Is there a limitation to what the body can tolerate from a force and speed perspective? And in some ways, are there ways that people can detrain or mitigate some of those things?
Yeah, so just to expand on that also, it's not just the size, it's also the way that practice takes place, the amount of practice, the number of games, a lot of things have changed. And with that, the potential impact of deconditioning when they stop playing becomes very different. We know from example from animal models that if you overtrain to stay in the brain for a second, you overtrain a given animal, there is partly BDNF-mediated expression of a change in plasticity with improved plasticity driven by that exercise. That's a good thing. But those animals that do a lot of that exercise, when they stop, not only do they lose that benefit, but actually reverse paradoxically to a loss. So what does that mean if that were to be the case in humans also? It probably means that you need to plan a deconditioning, decrease in exercise activity that some of the players do because they figure it out themselves. Others just continue to exercise because they like it. But we should be able to prescribe it and to make recommendations that are guided by data.
And one of the things that's distinct about the 1960s and 70s is that people trained, but they didn't really train all year long. You see present-day professionals and immediate former professionals taking very, very short, if any, breaks off. So to Alvaro's point, this is continuous training for years and years and years, and suddenly drops off.
In your beautiful and comprehensive presentation, there's one group that you didn't mention, and I wonder if you feel that the coaches and the teams and the leagues are partners or adversaries.
Well, thanks for the easy question. Are they partners or adversaries? I don't think that they are partners or adversaries. I think they are part of the structural factors that I think are important to consider. I think they become potential important positive or negative factors for the health and well-being of the players, depending on how that structure of reporting is set up. And part of the commitment that we've had is to make those kind of factors a specific focus on the analysis that we're doing for their health and well-being and recommendations. It wasn't an attempt to leave them out. They are very important components. And of course, in the news, we often hear about one aspect or another. But it's all aspects of the club structure, from physicians to coaches to trainers that are part of the structural system of health and provision for the players that are important, including their agents. Some are less obvious, right? But their agents, for example, are important factors as well.
So there are broad groups of people. It's not only the coaches and the players, but it's even those who have businesses, who have contracts or other relationships and agents. All of these folks have some influence on the health paradigm. The variation in coaches and other teams may be an important variable. So someone with an offensive philosophy that is running many more plays, or a situation where games are stacked very together, may be an important variable for us to find out about.
So as a former player, this is great. And I know you mentioned about this idea of not doing work in isolation. But as a researcher, how do you balance the almost infinite life variables that exist in this work, and being able to convey some tangible, practical things to players in real time, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And that is a challenge, of course. And I think that what we don't want is to be telling people, look, let's engage you, get data and all this kind of stuff. And 5 generations from now, that's not what we want to do. So, we want to make sure that we extract knowledge that we can convey to people right now. So let me give you one example, because Ross mentioned it. So one of the pilot studies that is supported is from Aaron Bagish. It's a study on cardiology. He's a cardiologist at MGH. And initially in college students, Harvard athletes, he showed that depending on the type of training, even within the pre-season period, they develop a cardiac enlargement, a heart enlargement, that could take one of 2 different forms. Depending on the training, if there was mostly aerobic, long distance, for rowers and runners and so forth, they develop a dilated, more cardiac capacity, more ejection fraction, no cortical wall thickness with it, whereas the strength training alone would develop, again, a cardiac enlargement, but mostly with wall thickness enlargement, concentric cardiomyopathy, with a risk potentially of not only arrhythmias, but also ischemia, and ultimately a losing of ejection fraction with hypertension. What he's gone on to show is that depending on the retraining and the practice schedule that you can do, you can in part compensate for that, and that treating hypertension, for example, if it develops, prevents damage long-term and doesn't change performance. Those are recommendations that should be implemented right now. Whether they're implemented or not may depend on structural aspects of their healthcare provision, but at least make the players aware of those things we should be doing.
And many of those things, as Alvaro said, are integrated. So sometimes players don't want to take antihypertensives because of their fear the impact on their performance. But they need to understand, and we need to translate the knowledge regarding the long-term impact. One of the key things that I tried to show is that we're dedicated to early knowledge translation now. For example, I tried to use a little bit of that soliloquy related to the fact that if we have a lot of offensive linemen who have sleep apnea, we know the deleterious effects of that on the neural system, the cardiac system, and others. Well, we really need to make that a part of early screening for people, or how we approach things. Or it may play into your question, is getting so big part of that risk factor, and do we need to deal with it up front?
As you guys talked about the players being bigger, stronger, and faster, for lack of a better term, another thing you see is the violence in the game with the helmet. And over the past 20 or so years, the evolution in the technology of the helmets hasn't improved. but at the same time, it sort of seems like they're being more used as a weapon now as opposed to a form of protection. Do you guys address that and other issues of equipment in your studies?
Well, I mean, I think as a first step, equipment issues are not yet one of the primary aims of the study, but it is one of the things that we're going to account for and deal with as to how it affects injury and how we can try to prevent injury. One of the things that you see now, and Rodney probably knows this a million times better than me, is this attempt to get away from this launching phenomena, because we have really created a weapon and some people are launching at high speed with that and really try to teach almost a rugby-style tackling. Not that that's completely safe either, but it has less of that helmet-to-helmet contact. Of the most recent reported concussions this year, a fairly high number of them are actually helmet-to-helmet.
Another question, please. What is your association with both the NFL Owners and the NFL Players Association? And I ask that question, let's say you identify something of concern early on in your research. Is there the opportunity, either through one or the other, to make an intervention now so that you can be looking at whether that's making an ongoing change?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's a very good question. Another easy one, yeah, like Rosa said, but a critical one, right? So we feel, and we have gone a long way to make sure that we should stay truly independent. That if we're going to deliver on the commitment to the players of providing the truth, that truth should go to the players, to the literature, and the NFLPA, the NFL can learn from it, and hopefully take the appropriate action based on that. But it shouldn't be going to them for them to decide what to do with that. So that's the commitment, is to make sure that whatever we learn, we actually, if it's important, make it public knowledge fast and broadly. And the independence in that regard of academic freedom, academic search, and of Harvard's independence of any funding agencies is obviously critical in that regard.
I mean, I think
sorry. I was going to say that said, we look forward to the opportunity to work with the many stakeholders and to learn from them and to exchange information and so forth, but not to let any of that exchange influence whatever we find.
To go to Alvaro's point, I mean, I think we've went to real extremes to make sure that we are independent, that we are scientifically independent, and that our interest is reporting the truth. And that truth could be we find something is deleterious, or perhaps maybe there's a lower risk of one disease or another in a group that trains this hard. It is possible. So we want to expose the entire truth, and when it really impacts people's health, get that out there as soon as possible.
Hi. You both alluded to the complex legal and ethical issues that are swirling around these topics. And I'm from an education project here in the Department of Genetics where we think a lot about those issues. And I'm wondering, as some of the genetic risk factors are identified in these studies, how does that feed back into the NFL and the current players? Of course, that's a very complicated topic. A series of issues.
Yeah, so I mean, it is a complicated issue, and it's going to be looked at. I mean, you know probably that there is a number of different measures that quote, scientific measures, evaluation ways that play into decisions of drafting a player or not. It's all over the news. And exactly what those are, how validated those are, that's something that is not always very clear. So if you have in that setting genetic markers and so forth, would there be the temptation to do so? Presumably so. I think that we are not in the business of doing regulations for the game or assessments of how a given business is conducted. What we should be in the business of is to make sure that we convey the information to the players so that they can make the appropriate informed decision as to what the implications are of what they're doing. And I think that's the commitment that we have. And if we identify genetic markers of a given risk or another or phenotypic characteristics, then I think that would be part of the truth to convey publicly.
And that's why we've been working with the Center for Bioethics, the Petrie Flem Center, because I think all of these are broad issues. You'd hate to see a scenario where a team is doing a genetic test on somebody and ruling necessarily somebody out unless they understood way ahead of time all of the associated issues.
Alvaro, thank you. That was really a great presentation. This has come a long way since when you started. It struck me when hearing Damian Richardson's story and a point that you made that 150,000 Pop Warner children end up in the ER every year. Is there any way to sort of, I don't know, when you sit down with Rodney Peete and you say, okay, you had 3 concussions when you played professional, you got hit a lot when you were at USC, and in high school you had the following things. Are you able to link back to early life exposures? Because the more we know about chronic disease, the more we know the importance of what happened between ages 10 and 17, such that what you find could actually be advice for Pop Warner leagues and not just NFL players, retired NFL players.
So I thank you. I think that's exactly the reason why both Rose and I were emphasizing the whole life perspective, the whole player perspective. I don't think that we can look at just one snippet of the time on the field or the years of the NFL career and pretend that we now understand the issues. It's going to depend a lot on what happened before.
Is that all self-reported by the player, or are you able to link back to college records and Pop Warner records?
So right now what we're doing is a questionnaire that is self-report and obviously with appropriate IRB approval and so forth, we're looking to get increasingly records as appropriate and with appropriate protection and there should be records from trainers and so forth that hopefully we'll be able to look at as well, to have more objective measures of the degree of injury that might happen, what evaluations happen, and so forth, including what repairs or not happened.
I mean, as you know, those early life issues are critical, so as we bring people here for further imaging, for further laboratory tests, for further biomechanical assessment, drilling down on those issues, as Alvaro said, is critical.
I wonder if we have, are we out of time?
We're over.
People want to stay.
We're over.
Feel welcome.
I was just wondering whether we should introduce Rodney Peete and Holly Robinson Peete, who are part of the advisors for the study, and maybe you want to share some thoughts.
Sure. This way?
Actually, we'll get out of your way.
We'll
get out of your way.
We'll give you space.
Maybe I should give my wife the mic. She does all the talking in the family.
As it should be.
As it should be. I guess I should stand. I'm excited about this, and there were some great questions. I think the presentation was fantastic, and all of the questions were great as well. The reason I'm excited about it is for the simple fact that, as it was mentioned, they're treating the whole player. It is about going back in history, about your family history. It's about when you started playing. I started playing football when I was 8 years old. And obviously there were certain traumas that happened at that point when my body was still developing. I was lucky enough to play in the NFL for 16 years. And through that time, I played with guys from different generations. We were just talking earlier that I came into the National Football League in 1989. And me being a guy that played 16 years, there were guys that, when I was a rookie, that were in the league for 10, 15 years. So they were playing in the 70s at a time where there were a lot of things going on that you wouldn't even dream of happening now. I can remember as a rookie coming into the locker room after practice and about 15 guys smoking cigarettes in the locker room, just lighting up like it was nothing. Fast forward to when I retired in 2005, you couldn't even dream of something like that happening. But I've had my share of injuries. I went through times where I got hit in the head and was a concussion, and they said, how many fingers am I holding up? And I said 2, and they said, okay, you're good, go back in the game. But knowing what we know now, and understanding what we know now, and having a real partnership, and I think the most important thing that was mentioned, an independent partnership that's not influenced by the NFL or the league, and the studies are confidential. And so it's vital for players like me and other players to share this information so we can understand the human body, so we can understand life after football. There are a lot of things that are unknown to us. I mean, it's a scary time. I turned 50 in March. And look, I've had torn both my Achilles tendons. I tore my patella tendon. I've had, who knows, just off the top of my head, I've had about 10 concussions. And, you know, when you look at the concussion protocols now, you're not allowed to play the next week after you've been diagnosed with having a concussion. For us, when I played, it was, you're good enough to play, your eyes look good, you know how many fingers I'm holding up, you can play next week. And who knows what kind of lingering effects that has. So it's scary. So it's vital not only for me, but for the future players, for the kids playing today, the young kids that are playing football. You just mentioned the 150,000 kids that are in the ER. It's important. It's my duty to give all the knowledge to these guys as I can so we can help those players. So we can help the players of my generation that are struggling right now. In particular, a guy that played here for a couple years, who was a very close friend of mine. I went to school with him, played with him, Junior Seau. And, you know, Junior was a guy that you would never known he was going through what he was going through. And I was his close friend, and I had no idea. And so to be able to understand what's going on and be able to provide these guys with the knowledge so they can understand the symptoms and understand the triggers and really see the signs and help me see the signs in friends that I know, it's vital. It's vital. So I appreciate what you're doing, and I appreciate the opportunity to work with you guys, because this is something that's long, long overdue. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, man.
That's it.